Thank you so much, and thank you for the invitation to speak here today. Merci pour l'invitation de vous adresser la parole aujourd'hui. Je vais présenter en anglais, mais je salue nos groupes membres francophones et je vous invite à me poser des questions en français à la fin lors de la période de questions. So let me begin by recognizing that I speak to you today from the unceded and traditional territory of the Mi'kmaq people. And as a provincial organization, the NBN also conducts its work on the unceded and traditional territories of the Wetaskiwé and Passamaquoddy people. Next slide. Just a little bit about the NBN. The NBN, New Brunswick Environmental Network, was established in 1991. It's a communication network that links together over 110 nonprofit environmental organizations, big and small, French and English, and in all corners of our beautiful province. The year 2021 marked our 30th anniversary. The role of the NBN is to improve communication and cooperation amongst environmental groups and between these groups, government and other sectors that can include academia, business, industry, and large institutions like health and education. The NBN is not an advocacy group and does not itself take positions on any issue. Rather, we provide educational opportunities for our members and associate groups, encourage them to speak with a common voice, and take unified positions when appropriate, and more generally, just encourage the growth of the environmental movement in the province. We also maintain important online tools like our eco-directory, our reference library, and our monthly calendar of events, just to name a few. Next slide. The NBN's main mechanisms for delivering on its mission are issue-based caucuses and collaborative efforts. First, the caucuses that facilitate communication among member groups and can provide relevant and expert input on specific environmental issues of importance to provincial policymaking and broader public education. Currently, the NBN facilitates caucuses on watersheds, on environmental rights, and herbicide spraying and nuclear energy. And caucuses come and go based on the reality of the day. For their part, collaborative efforts are an innovative and unique model of collaboration developed by the NBN over the last decade or so that provide an opportunity for agencies that share a common goal to advance the development of policy and programming that's relevant, broadly supported, and implemented on a cross-sectoral basis. The NBN serves as a secretariat for 4 active collaboratives on sustainability education, on children's environmental health, on biodiversity, and I guess more pertinently to today, on climate change adaptation. So I'll be referring to these caucuses and collaboratives throughout my presentation. Personally, I've had the pleasure of serving as the executive director of the NBN since June 2020, so I'm still pretty new, but since that time, I've witnessed a significant contribution of our province's many environmental groups to the social, economic, and environmental well-being of their respective communities, notably in taking action to address the climate emergency. Though our many groups may not always be unanimous on the exact path to take to lead us towards the low carbon and climate stable world, I know that we could all agree that we are not moving nearly fast enough down any of these paths. Just a little bit about my former life as a small-scale organic farmer. When I was a farmer, I witnessed firsthand how changing climate was impacting our lives as my farming projects faced damaging winds, prolonged droughts, heavy rain events, or even midsummer hail. No one has a more visceral understanding of how unpredictable our climate has become than our farmers. In this regard, I look forward to presentations coming up from colleagues at the National Farmers Union and the New Brunswick Ag Alliance. Last week and earlier today, you heard from a few NBN members and associate groups. I hope you took note of what they had to say. You'll hear me echo many of the recommendations here today. As the province looks to update its climate change action plan, my job as director of a provincial network is to amplify the voices of many smaller local groups working to affect change in their respective communities and who do not have the privilege of addressing you here today. We as a network will be encouraging many of them to make written submissions. Leaning on their work as member groups, many in writings with representatives on this committee, I'll stress the importance of a few key points which you may view as recommendations. So next slide. Slide 4, I think we should be on. So my first, I guess, point or key point is about collaboration with NGOs, big and small, in pursuing climate action. This really is a must. You've heard from a few New Brunswick's larger NGOs today, but the smaller local environmental groups are just as essential to educating citizens about the climate crisis and providing them with opportunities to take meaningful action. Local environment groups act as eyes and ears on the ground. I'll give you an example. In my own riding of Kent South, the Groupe de Développement Durable du Pays de Coquang through the maintenance and monitoring of a network of nesting boxes conducted by its numerous volunteers, was able to bring attention to a large die-off of young swallows this past spring. The exact cause of the die-off is unknown, though unusual climatic conditions is suspected. And in absence of the local environment group, this worrisome event may have gone unnoticed. On this point of collaboration with local environmental groups, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention the NBN's active watershed caucus, composed of nearly 30 local watershed management groups or water protection groups. Local watershed groups provide a real and essential climate service through monitoring of ice jams, fish populations, water temperatures, general water quality, as well as through conducting activities such as shoreline restoration and riparian zone plantings, which further protect us from things like flooding and can serve as carbon sinks. A 2021 report by the International Institute for Sustainable Development stated that community-based watershed management is a cost-effective 3-to-1 and scientifically rigorous method to collect medium and long-term water quality monitoring data at the watershed scale. In the same report, they note that a rapidly changing climate across Canada will exacerbate issues of water quality and quantity and will demand an adaptive management approach. Goal 4, the province's own strategy, water strategy, identifies the need to work cooperatively with local actors on water protection and management. Similarly, New Brunswick's many local naturalist groups can help monitor wildlife populations through various citizen science initiatives, thus increasing the information available on the impacts of climate change on biodiversity by establishing baselines for species of interest. So I encourage you to better get to know your local watershed groups, naturalist clubs in your ridings if you don't already. They do really good work and can be useful allies in advancing priorities as set by government. Next slide. The second key point, continued and increased funding for climate work undertaken by NGOs or NGOs. Environmental groups do a lot with very little. Access to funding through things like ETF or the Wildlife Trust Fund is essential. Provincial funding often serves as leverage for these groups for other levels of funding. So an updated climate change action plan must recognize the value of investing in this sort of work and must not only maintain, but should look to increase existing funding pools to allow these smaller groups to do even more. Multi-year funding should be considered as it allows groups to plan for longer-term results. The current public health crisis has shown that resources can indeed be found when the government recognizes the urgency of a situation and acts accordingly. The climate crisis is no less an emergency than the COVID-19 pandemic, and in fact, has its own serious public health implications, which is why the NBN can count on groups like the New Brunswick Lung Association and the New Brunswick chapter of the Canadian Associations of Physicians for the Environment as its members. So funding is key. Many communities now have climate change adaptation plans, often developed with the support of their local NGOs. But what good are these plans if there are no resources available, both financial and human, to implement them? Allocation of funds from the Climate Change Fund must be more transparent and should be spent on new climate initiatives, not kept in general government coffers, nor used to pay for existing government responsibilities. So I think of things where I see like road maintenance or culvert replacement that probably are part of everyday operations. New revenue from a growing carbon price should be directed to new investments in mitigation to secure things that we know work, like deep retrofits, transformation of public transit, transportation, as well as investments in expensive adaptation measures, such as protecting or relocating key pieces of infrastructure, sewage lagoon, dikes, etc. And I would add, build off the presentation right before me, invest in that sort of stuff as well, where we know it works. So to further increase the fund's transparency and accountability, an open application stream should also be created. Next slide. Our next key point, increased transparency and availability of climate-related data and information to help assess risk and improve decision-making. So the NBN was pleased to see the recent launch of Climate Atlantic as the Atlantic region's new climate services hub, and to welcome it as an associate member of the NBN. I share the view of its director, Sabine Dietz, that those working on the ground often lack access to the most relevant, accurate, and up-to-date information. And when it is accessible, it's often not easy or not in easy to understand formats. There is a lack of literacy around the impacts of climate change, the risks, our resiliency, and how to increase it, and options for adaptation. Things like the recently released flood maps are definitely a step in the right direction. but we need to know how climate will impact us in many different areas and the risks this represents. Our province relies on a small number of industries for a disproportionate amount of our GDP, and many of those sectors will be at risk of climate change. So we need climate data information on adaptation for specific sectors. How will our fisheries cope, our forests? Which agricultural crops will be most impacted? How can we diversify to become more resilient to what lies ahead? Diversification is especially important when considering our food system. The pandemic helped make clear the vulnerabilities of our global food supply chains. Climate change is already causing similar disruptions, and this will only worsen. Not only will we find it difficult to import some of the foods we've come to enjoy, but farmers are already finding it difficult to access the inputs they need to do their jobs well to grow the food they grow. I share the concerns of my colleague, Suzanne Fournier, at the National Farmers Union, who stressed to me the importance of a scaled down, localized climate data for farmers, so they know how to adapt and how they adapt how they grow, and support for farmer-led initiatives instead of top-down approaches. So here again, watershed groups, naturalist clubs, food sovereignty and food security organizations such as the NBN member group Food for All New Brunswick can all help in generating the needed data and information. Lean on them. Next slide. The next point is about clear communication from government to the public on the urgency of the climate crisis and honesty regarding the solutions available to us in the timeframe we face. So earlier you heard from Dr. Louise Comeau from the Conservation Council speak about how public education is essential to mobilizing citizens during the rapid transition to come. Better communications is needed to educate citizens and build stronger mental models, as she calls it, especially relating to solutions and their effectiveness. Our communications and engagement efforts should aim to increase public confidence and build social agency to solve climate change. As you would know, obtaining social license has never been more important, and communities must be engaged early and they must be engaged often if we are to get them on board with the kind of transformational societal projects required as part of the transition to a low carbon future, be it new wind farms, solar arrays, or hydro lines. Community-based energy and home energy generation should be prioritized and supported, and obstacles to these removed and incentives created. Throughout the pandemic, we've seen how the public can be mobilized to make sacrifices in the name of the public good when the urgency of the situation is explained to them clearly and with the sense of gravity it requires. So just imagine if the director of our climate change secretariat were to stand next to the premier or the minister of environment on a regular basis and communicate to the public the seriousness of the climate crisis and what is being asked of them, much like we've seen our chief medical officer, Dr. Russell, do these past 2 years. Or what if we had a special all-party committee tackling climate, like we've done with COVID? As mentioned at the outset, the NBN currently supports several caucuses, including a fairly new caucus on nuclear energy, specifically on modular nuclear reactors. Members of this caucus believe, like you do, in the need for urgent implementation of genuine climate action. Through thoughtful consideration and research, they have determined that this includes energy efficiency measures plus rapid electrification of the grid through renewable clean energy sources, but that it should not include new nuclear energy. Funding towards research and development for yet unproven solutions such as MNRs takes away from funding needed for more proven, ready-to-go solutions. The cost of energy from MNRs, when and if developed, is currently projected to be higher than that of renewable power. Electricity production from these MNRs will not be available before 2030 at the least, and hence too late to help meet carbon emission reduction targets to keep global warming below 1.5 degrees Celsius. So I share here today the view of the caucus that nuclear energy is not explicitly part of the current climate action plan and that it should not figure in an updated version. More generally, we must steer clear of communicating uncertain solutions. I put this on the heading communications, such as MNRs, but also things like biomass burning being proposed as a replacement fuel for Belledune. We should stick with what we know works. That said, communications from government must also include reassurances and plans of a just transition for communities like Belledune that have been disproportionately impacted by industrial activity and the cumulative environmental and health impacts it brings. Workers need to know what comes next and how their skill sets will be redeployed to contribute to a low carbon economy. We salute the work of the NBN member group Projet On from the Shutout region for the work in this regard. In May 2021, a working group of the NBN submitted a brief to the Minister of Local Governance as part of the consultations on local governance reform. One of the points raised in the brief was the need for statements of provincial interest. These sorts of statements are key in setting minimum standards for sustainable land use planning, for watershed management and flood prevention, for climate adaptation and mitigation, and for protection of ecologically important and sensitive natural areas, so that everyone is operating from the same playbook, regardless of the local governance structure in place where they live. The NBN was pleased to see SPIs outlined in Minister Alain's white paper. These SPIs should include strong directives to decision makers and actors for change all the way down the line, and include clear climate considerations. SPIs, although welcome, must not be seen as a substitute for strong environmental law and regulations and their proper enforcement. Finally, on this point, the NBN has and will continue to support the government in sharing news of programs and initiatives with a positive impact on our environment and climate. So be direct and honest in your communications, but also remain hopeful, speak to the things people love, use humor, engage artists, and don't be afraid to reach out to new audiences that have less traditionally engaged in climate action. Next slide. So intersectoral cooperation. Climate action is no longer the exclusive domain of environmental groups. Most all sectors now have accepted the science, have stepped up to the plate, and are looking to contribute. As an example, over the past 2 years, the NBN has worked with Green Economy Canada, leading the exploration to establish a green economy hub here in New Brunswick. Green Economy New Brunswick, which we've called it, will host its official launch this Thursday, and will work with local businesses to accelerate New Brunswick's transition to a low carbon economy. Within New Brunswick and really across Canada, SMEs are the backbone of our economy, employing 9 out of 10 private sector workers and contributing more than half of our GDP. An update to the Climate Change Action Plan should more clearly outline support for SMEs and meeting our shared climate goals. I look forward to hearing presentations from the NB Business Council and the Conseil économique du Nouveau-Brunswick about how the business community can be best supported in taking stronger climate action. Next slide. So education and capacity building at all levels to more rapidly implement known climate solutions. Through its various collaborative efforts and projects, the NBN has been working hard to build capacity among key sectors and agents for climate action. I will share 2 examples. First, our Sustainability Education Alliance, with over 1,000 participants strong and growing. The NBN has helped build capacity amongst educators for integrating climate change teachings into the curriculum. This needs to happen in the classroom, but we need to also invest more in experiential learning programs and outdoor learning programs. Strong climate literacy must be regarded as indispensable as an outcome of our public education experience as anything else. Teachers today get this and are thirsting for more resources and support in bringing climate change teachings into the classroom. I point to the excellent work of NBN members, the Gaia Project, or Brilliant Labs in this regard, as well as the work of NBN's own Great Minds Think Outside program, which gives educators the skills and resources they need to teach their students outside whatever the subject matter. Next slide. The NB Climate Change Adaptation Collaborative, with participation from nonprofits, academia, and government, and for which the NBN acts as secretariat, works to advance and mainstream adaptation across sectors. It has a number of strategic priorities, 2 which I'll speak to today. First, mainstreaming adaptation and planning, and also the promotion of natural and nature-based infrastructure. As you've heard several of my colleagues say already, our province's natural infrastructure is extremely important in addressing the climate crisis. That role needs to be broadly recognized and acknowledged when considering how we develop our communities moving forward. Natural approaches such as living shorelines or naturalized stormwater management ponds, but also protected areas such as dunes and wetlands help reduce risk from climate impacts such as recurring heavy rainfall or coastal storm surges. Groups in your ridings like Vert Rivage and Balaras and Chipagan, or EOS Eco Energy and Memram Cook Tantramar, or Vision H2O and the Chiriac Bay Watershed Association and Chiriac Beaubassin have all done exemplary work in this area. There should be priority emphasis placed on such approaches and the many co-benefits it brings, including recreation, tourism, and human health. New Brunswick is already a leader in this field and will continue to lead with your support. Finally, on this point, in partnership with Nature MB, who you heard from earlier, and with the financial support of NRCan and the ETF, the NBN has been working to build capacity amongst engineers, amongst planners and NGOs for a broader adoption of nature-based infrastructure in adapting to the worst impacts of climate change. Over the next few years, we hope to turn our focus to building capacity amongst municipal stakeholders, local decision makers, and municipal staff filling the gap in knowledge on natural and nature-based infrastructure and providing a structured methodology to identify areas suitable for nature-based infrastructure through conservation or implementation based on the value for climate risk mitigation. Next slide.
If I could just interrupt, you've come to the end of 20 minutes.
Okay.
So I'm wondering if perhaps you could work the rest of your presentation into the answers from the, committee members. Okay, perfect.
Yeah.
On va commencer avec Madame Landry.
Sorry. Merci, Monsieur Murphy. Thank you, Mr. Chair. J'aimerais commencer par vous donner l'opportunité de finir avec votre dernière présentation, votre dernière slide sur l'engagement des jeunes.
Oui, merci. J'ai ajouté l'engagement des jeunes dans ma présentation parce qu'en survolant les gens qui avaient été invités à présenter, je n'ai pas vu d'organisme de jeunes et c'est très central à la mission du RENB. Ce que je voulais dire à ce sujet-là, c'est que oui, ça a toujours été central à notre organisme et que les jeunes, on le sait, sont de plus en plus préoccupés par la question du climat. On sait que les décisions que l'on va faire aujourd'hui ou que l'on néglige de faire aujourd'hui auront le plus gros impact sur nos générations futures. Donc, on doit les engager dans la lutte au changement climatique. Si vous réussissez à engager un jeune aujourd'hui dans cette lutte-là, c'est sûrement eux qui vont être assis dans vos chaises par le futur. C'est une fois qu'on les embarque dans la lutte, on a réussi à les garder. Puis, je mentionnais le travail de plusieurs de nos groupes. Si je pense sur les campus universitaires, comme le groupe Symbiose à l'Université de Moncton, qui était très central, par exemple, à l'organisation des marches pour le climat qu'on a connues en 2019. La dernière fois que le climat faisait vraiment les manchettes là, avant COVID, c'était parce que les jeunes étaient dans la rue et demandaient plus d'action sur le climat. Donc, moi, les propositions plus concrètes que j'avais pour la jeunesse, par exemple, pourquoi pas penser à quelque chose comme, en anglais, un Civilian Climate Corps, où les jeunes seraient mobilisés pour faire des projets pour le climat. Ça pourrait se faire à travers du programme SEED qui existe déjà, où on crée des opportunités de travail pour les jeunes pendant les étés. Pourquoi pas créer quelque chose comme ça, mais pour le climat? Puis deuxièmement, il faudrait que la voix des jeunes soit inclue dans tout comité aviseur ou consultatif qui serait créé, entre autres le comité consultatif, le conseil d'aviseur pour les changements climatiques qui est attendu depuis assez longtemps, là, qui était dans le plan initial. Donc ça, c'est qu'est-ce que j'avais à dire sur les jeunes, mais ils ont une voix dans ce sujet-là.
Oui, et vous avez tellement raison parce que on dirait que ce qui a bougé dans les dernières années sur les changements climatiques, ça a été mené de front par des jeunes. En fait, une petite jeune, Greta, en fait, j'oublie son nom de famille, là, mais quelqu'un qui a fait bouger en fait, des nations sur la question des changements climatiques. I would like to say that I find that you have very good recommendation, and I won't ask many questions. I just want to say that I do agree with you on, some of them that are key, and I'm looking at mainly what we have to do in the next climate plan action plan regarding education and awareness. I do agree with Louise Comeau, what she said this morning on that, and I think we have to do more. And it also has to come from one voice or not too many voices. There's so many players in the field. You have 110 members, so each of them, they have their own opinion, their own rules and everything. So I think we have to concentrate key messages to some organizations. And I would like to know if your mission is something like that, or could look at something like that for the future. And I'm not saying that you're not relevant. I'm just saying that could it be more focused for what you're doing?
No, most definitely, and that is like really essentially what our mission is. So of our 110 member groups, like many of them work on education. For example, what we hope to do and what we've succeeded to do is to bring them together, to get them to speak from a common voice when that's possible. So on topic of education, the Sustainability Education Alliance, that's composed of environmental groups working on education, but also of educators, people within the school districts, all meeting regularly to talk about shared priorities and shared messaging. So I'm definitely on board. Like, we want to be speaking as much as possible with a cohesive voice, and that is definitely our role, and that's what we aim to do every day.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. That is good recommendations. It's clear. And I thank you for your presentation. Merci beaucoup, M. Murphy, pour votre présentation. Je vais passer la parole à mon collègue MLA Leblanc.
Merci.
Monsieur Leblanc.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Merci. Merci, M. Murphy, pour la présentation. Mes questions sont en français, comme que vous l'avez convenu. Pour votre organisation, votre réseau, puis votre présentation était très élaborée, très exhaustive. Quelles seraient les trois grandes priorités, les trois grandes choses que le comité ici devrait prendre en note pour élaborer dans son prochain plan? Donc, pour nous élaborer, plus nous diriger vers quelque chose de direct, concret.
OK, oui, bonne question. Puis j'y avais pensé. Je suis là depuis 18 mois, puis ma constatation, c'est qu'il existe beaucoup de solutions. On les connaît. Mais il n'y a pas toujours la capacité. Donc, ma première réponse, c'est le renforcement des capacités chez les groupes, mais aussi dans les communautés. C'est bien beau de savoir quoi faire, mais si les gens ne sont pas formés dans leur poste pour entreprendre des actions climatiques, on ne se rendra pas très loin. Donc, renforcement de capacité à tous les niveaux, c'est très, très clé. Deuxièmement, le financement. La même chose, je l'ai mentionné dans ma présentation, mais plusieurs de nos groupes ont travaillé avec leur communauté à développer des plans d'adaptation au changement climatique, mais que là, ils constatent que ça reste sur l'étagère puis ça accumule de la poussière. Donc, ils n'ont pas les moyens, souvent financiers, de mettre en place les recommandations qui sortent des plans d'adaptation. Donc, il faut trouver les ressources financières. Puis finalement, c'est vraiment, je pense que les multiples groupes environnementaux au niveau local et provincial font beaucoup de travail sur l'éducation et la communication, mais on voudrait une voix plus forte de la part du gouvernement. Comme j'ai donné l'exemple, avec le COVID, ça a été clair pour tout le monde qu'on était en crise et que le public avait certains sacrifices ou un rôle à jouer pour nous sortir de cette crise-là. Je n'entends pas le même sorte de message venant du gouvernement pour la crise climatique et je pense qu'on va devoir avoir du leadership plus fort du niveau du gouvernement provincial sur ce sujet-là, de parler d'une voix plus forte là-dessus. Donc, ce seraient mes trois focus.
Une de mes dernières questions, si on a le temps, c'est y a-t-il une législation particulière ou des politiques que vous aimeriez voir la province adopter?
Il y en aurait probablement plusieurs, mais celle à laquelle je pense, ce serait peut-être, j'ai parlé de plusieurs de nos groupes, c'est des groupes de bassin versant, donc plusieurs dans ta circonscription. Et en ce moment, la province a une stratégie sur l'eau, mais ça reste une stratégie. Et on aimerait voir plus que ça devienne plus fort dans le terme de législation, donc pour protéger nos cours d'eau. Donc ça serait peut-être à quoi je pointerais pour passer d'une stratégie à quelque chose avec plus de poids, que ce soit nos eaux douces, mais aussi au niveau côtier pour nous protéger là, face à ce qui s'en vient.
Oui. Ben, regarde, je suis d'accord que dans ma région, je suis choyé d'avoir Écovision 2021, dans Chediac, Beaubassin-Capellé, puis on a aussi les différents groupes qui ont travaillé d'arrache-pied avec les défis qu'on a eus dans la baie de Chediac. Donc, le bassin versant de la baie de Chediac fait du travail incroyable. Et aussi avec le Fonds d'environnement en fiducie de la province, ça lui donne la chance d'avoir des projets. Ouais. Pour finir ma période de questions, fournissez-vous des services directement au gouvernement du Nouveau-Brunswick ou à l'industrie au Nouveau-Brunswick?
Des services. On nous demande... Ce qu'on peut faire, c'est rassembler. Lorsque le gouvernement cherche à sonder la communauté environnementale, on est souvent prêt et en position de rassembler les gens. Par exemple, on l'a fait au cours de la dernière année. On a rassemblé des groupes pour parler avec les gérants des parcs au Nouveau-Brunswick, le parc Nouveau-Brunswick, pour avoir une discussion sur comment il pourrait avoir plus de collaboration. On l'a fait pour parler des besoins en recherche à la demande du secrétariat des changements climatiques. On a rassemblé nos groupes pour savoir quels seraient leurs besoins en recherche. Donc, on le fait souvent. On l'a fait, par exemple, pour éduquer nos groupes sur qu'est-ce qui étaient les possibilités de financement avec les programmes qui existent au gouvernement. Donc, oui, on collabore souvent avec le gouvernement pour faire connaître à la fois leur programme, mais aussi pour qu'eux puissent entendre de la communauté environnementale ce qu'ils ont besoin, ce qui est demandé. Avec l'industrie, on a des relations, par exemple, j'ai mentionné le Brunswick Business Council, on est en conversation avec eux. Si on était demandé, oui, on serait ouvert. On se voit vraiment comme des facilitateurs pour créer de la discussion puis de l'échange entre différents secteurs.
Merci beaucoup. Merci, Monsieur le Président. C'est toutes mes questions.
Okay, merci. Mr. Kuhn, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and good afternoon, Mr. Murphy. I want to talk to you about number 4 in your key points of importance. Clear communication from government to the public on the urgency of the climate crisis. So it has always puzzled me that neither at the provincial or federal levels that government has taken this work on, despite having done so in the past on other significant issues. How do you see, or how do your groups, I guess, see, if you've had these discussions, this taking place? What would it look like? Would it be the Climate Change Secretariat launching some kind of awareness campaign, or would it be some other part of government doing it, or some collaboration? What would that look like?
A good question. Where it comes from, to me, is not so much the important part, though I could see it. I did suggest, I guess, in my presentation that it could come from the Climate Change Secretariat. We have strong leadership there. They're thinking and working on climate change every day. I think what the public could benefit from is seeing a regular face that they can come to trust. I think we all have gained a lot of trust, for example, in Dr. Russell, because we see her every day. We come to believe that the advice is advice we should follow. So just having a face within the government with speaking with urgency. I think you heard from Dr. Comeau, who's done a lot of research on this, that positive messaging works best. Like, we need to be honest with people and direct, but we also need to speak to the things they love and that they stand to lose. I think that has been shown to work, and she has shown it in her research. I think we can engage kind of some more unusual players that shouldn't be unusual, but can we engage artists? Can we use humor? This is what we need to do to kind of break through and really get people involved. Because like Dr. Comeau said, if we don't, then when comes time to do big things, we won't have the public on board. And we've seen that with projects here and there where the community was not on board, and social license has never been more important. So I think no matter where it comes from, I think we just need to find a leader, a strong voice that the public can recognize. And because that message is coming already from NGOs for sure. Where it's lacking in my mind is kind of higher up.
Well, among your member groups, there's plenty of experience and expertise in communications, because that's part of what they do in terms of carrying out their missions around the province. And so it seems to me there's a wealth of experience there to draw on. So has there been any sort of collaboration with the Climate Change Secretariat about generating some thinking around what a communications and awareness kind of campaign might look like in the province?
In certain instances, like broadly, I'm not sure, but I can speak to some collaboration. Like, for example, at the NBN, I mentioned our work on natural infrastructure. One piece of that has been coastal protection. And through the support of ETF and the involvement of the Climate Change Secretariat, where we are currently working and will launch in the next month, large-scale communication campaign on what coastal property owners can do to protect their shorelines with knowing what's coming with climate change. So, and that's been a really great collaboration between NGOs and the government. So the actual visual, what we'll be putting out there in terms of material is somewhat generic. So I'm not sure, like, will it be recognized as coming from government or from NGO? That wasn't our point. We just wanted to make sure we had punchy communication that would reach out to people. And the ideas have come from both sides, from government and what they know, and from NGOs and what they know has worked as well. So that's an example. More broadly, I can't speak to that, but I would love to see that happen.
So is there a caucus within the Brunswick Environmental Network that's focused on climate change communications by any chance?
What I could speak to here, we like I said, our caucuses come and go based on like the energy and what's going on in the moment. We had for several years a caucus called the Just Transition Caucus. It dissolved over the last bit, but one of the last big pieces of work it did was release a document called Greenprint 2021. In 2010, the NBN with its members released a document called Greenprint 2010, and that is basically an action plan for where we might want to head as a province. So it's meant for anyone to pick up and get ideas on what we can do on a large number, not just climate, but a large number of environmental issues. So I would say that's a piece of that where the environmental community got together and tried to come up with the most consensus-based vision for sustainable New Brunswick as possible. So I think that could be done again, but currently, no, but I take your point, and it is like a caucus around climate communications could be, could be very fruitful.
Yeah, I believe so. So sticking with this theme, only in the schools now, so you touched on school curriculum. We heard from the Center, what do they call it, the Atlantica Center for Energy Projects, or anyway, they talked about collaboration with the Department of Education and the schools to talk about mostly, anyway, all various different energy sources. So when you talk about curriculum, are you aware of organizations who are members or of the network who are working with the Department of Education specifically on climate education, or is that something that's underway, or it's not happening?
It's definitely happening. Yeah, it's definitely happening. And the NBN and the Sustainability Education Alliance, that's kind of the central hub. We often get queries from people within the school districts, within the Department of Education, or from NGOs, or directly from educators on what's out there in terms of resources and how they can begin to bring climate teachings into the classroom and into their curriculum. So that's definitely happening. I think of like some great groups that you might have heard of, like the Gaia Project, which is doing phenomenal work on helping teachers teach climate, but also more broadly, we run a program called Great Minds Think Outside at the NBN, which is basically trainers coming from all these different NGOs across the province who have joined together to go into schools, work with teachers, and give them tips, equip them to bring their classrooms outside. Because I think that's another way I talked about, like how you really grab those youth and keep them. Well, those experiences, that teacher that took you outside to learn, like with your hands in the dirt and playing with bugs, and that's the teacher you're going to remember, and that's what's going to stick with you. So we're really big on that as well, outdoor learning and experiential learning. Like, can you learn about the sciences and writing and math and all that by actually doing stuff, by building a solar panel, by, I don't know, thinking about how you could redesign energy for a community. Like, can we do those things? So we're definitely doing that, and so many of our member groups are involved. Like the Sustainable Education Alliance is one of our biggest programs, or our biggest programs. So education is something that requires kind of all hands on deck, and I think like we do have a lot of energy going into that, into this province.
But it doesn't sound like there's a formal relationship between the Sustainable Education Alliance and the Department of Education, or am I wrong?
There is, like I said, there is a formal, and on our steering committee, for example, we would have representatives. All our collaboratives are about bringing together the Anglo world, academia, government, and so on the steering committee for that collaborative, we would have representatives of the department and of the various districts and teachers as well. So that exchange is happening. We'd like to see more formalization of climate teachings in curriculum, but like that discussion is happening. Yeah.
Excellent, thanks for clearing that up. My final point was I really like the idea of the climate core. Can you just flesh out a little bit what that might look like and the thinking that might have gone on today?
Yeah, sure. These are ideas that we've seen proposed elsewhere in the United States. I think it's come up more. I think even President Biden has given it at least lip service. But we've had, the U.S. has its Peace Corps. We've had different kind of like wide scale mobilization of young people and just people in general to attack big societal projects. So my thinking is we do job creation programs already. Can we just scale that up? And can a youth take a year off to work on a climate project, for example, instead of going to university? Can we fund, put more funding into youth initiative climate projects, more money for businesses, organizations to hire youth to start implementing these climate solutions? So I think it's just a scaling up. Like I mentioned the SEED program, which allows businesses and organizations to hire students already, but it's that kind of really ramped up and focused on climate.
Okay, thanks, appreciate it.
Thank you very much, Mr. Cohn. Mr. Austin, the floor is now yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I want to thank you for your presentation today. I think it's very important. One key part that you mentioned that I haven't heard a whole lot, I guess over the last couple of days, it has been mentioned, I guess, a couple of times, but is in relation to food security and, a sense of independence there. And I don't think we have to look too far to see how dependent New Brunswickers are on the global food market and how, obviously the pandemic has caused a lot of disruptions in that global food market. I mean, I'm watching videos around North America where store shelves are they're becoming empty, and inflation, the cost of food, all of these things combining seem to be a perfect storm for food insecurity here at home. So I guess the question I would have is, from your point of view, how is government faring in relation to food security, and what recommendations would your organization make to help ramp that up?
So I'd be careful to make recommendations. I think you'll hear from the National Farmers Union and the Ag Alliance, but we do have member groups within our network. I think of Food for All New Brunswick that launched what they call the Eater's Guide to Climate Change over this past year, which is an excellent little document that I could forward along that gives tips to the consumers on how to make better food choices with climate in mind. But I think there's a movement building, but like traditionally if I may, like our agriculture sector has been based on a few commodity crops, and we've seen like COVID has just been so illuminating to make clear what probably we should already known, but that we need to diversify. We need to make sure we're growing the foods we want to eat. I put that into my presentation. I couldn't. I'm a former organic farmer, so it's like pretty near and dear to my heart. But I know not just on the what's available, what crops are we growing and where are they coming from, but also I know farmers are finding it increasingly difficult even just to access the tools and the inputs they need that they're used to. I'm thinking about plastic mulches, things like drip tape. All these things are dependent on petrochemicals. They're coming from away, and we're seeing that shift. So there's a big adjustment that needs to happen in that sector as well. The NBN's role in that is just to convene the conversation. Our Climate Change Adaptation Collaborative chose building relationships with the agricultural sector as its theme for its annual conference this year. And we were posing that question, like, what can the environmental community do to support farmers and adapting to climate change? Because we can't have that rest entirely on their shoulders. When you're a farmer, you're sole focus, your day-to-day focus is like getting the stuff to grow successfully. So we need to support them, and we need to listen to them, and we need to make sure that any kind of solutions they bring to the table, that there's mechanisms in there to make those happen.
Yeah, I think that those are some valid points, and I do strongly believe that we have to ramp up our agriculture industry in New Brunswick and diversify it. You know, it seems it's potatoes, it's apples, it's maple syrup, blueberries, and you know, once you start going out to other options, it becomes somewhat limited. So I think on the farming side, and I don't know if I'm getting away from your organization's kind of mission or directive, but what about the concept of not so much large scale farming, but individual greenhouses or gardens and this sort of thing? Does your organization do anything to promote that or to highlight that or give any direction on that, or is that a little bit out of the scope?
It's to some extent it's out of the scope, but I can mention, for example, through our Sustainable Education Alliance, one program we ran over the past 2 years is what we call their School Garden Initiative. So people want, like, especially with COVID, people were looking to garden. You're absolutely right with that, as they were in schools. Like, teachers knew that going outside with their class was kind of, one, it was safer, and like, it really engaged the students. So we saw this really big increase in interest for school gardens. And so we ran a 2-year initiative where we were working with teachers to bring them from like the initial conceptualizing what the school garden would look like, to buying the seeds, to buying the compost, to everything they need, to putting the seed in the ground, to figuring out who was going to take care of the garden over the summer and harvest the vegetables in the fall. So I full-heartedly, and I think some of our member groups like Food for All would say yes, like we need to think about how we rethink agriculture on the big level, like diversify there, but also empower citizens to grow food at home. So I would point to Food for All MB, which is an associate member of our network, because they really have the expertise there. But we're seeing it where we saw it this past year or two was in education, teachers wanting to take that on and impart that to their students.
Yeah, and I think that's really important because, again, as much as we understand the perfect storm of food insecurity, I think we're also seeing perfect opportunity because, when prices of food go up, people want, options that are not as expensive. And if there's, but I think the biggest thing right now is, I think we're at the beginning stages of it, because I am seeing more and more people that I never thought would put a garden in are putting a garden in now, and greenhouses and this sort of thing. And, I think I think we're missing an opportunity to really ramp that up and give people, again, independence. It gives them a chance to save a few dollars long term, and have better food. I mean, just locally grown out of your own backyard type of thing. So anyway, I know I'm getting on a soapbox there, but I just that's really all I had for questions, and I appreciate your presentation, and thank you, Mr. Chair. Good.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Austin. Mr. Collins.
Good afternoon, Mr. Murphy, and thank you for appearing today, and thank you for the presentation. It's been very informative. I guess I'd just like to ask you a couple of quick questions, and then I'll defer to my my counterparts here for some additional questions, should there be any. But I'd like to speak to you with respect to government's Nature Legacy program, which is effectively doubling the amount of protected areas in New Brunswick. And my understanding is that several NGOs were involved in offering feedback and collaborating throughout the process. Did NBN participate in this process?
Yeah, so the NBN, one of its 4 collaboratives is Biodiversity Collaborative. So on that, and on a steering committee, we would have representatives from a lot of the big conservation NGOs, but the NBN acts as a secretariat. So again, the role being convening all those players, all those stakeholders, and entering them into conversation. So we've been able to feed into it that way. We also, one thing we did as part of a wildlife webinar series we ran last year, we kicked it off actually with a presentation from Dr. Heather Loomer, who works on the Nature Legacy program, who was talking about the candidate conserved areas, so how New Brunswickers could put up or kind of propose sites for protection. And so we ran that. It was super well attended, actually. I think it was the most popular of all the webinars we ran in that series. And then, of course, like I mentioned, like the NBN, we're always going to say yes to sharing government initiatives that help protect our environment and help fight climate change. And so that is a program that we've promoted, especially the part about candidate conserved areas. And what we said, it's great. It's something that the environmental community asked for. We were really happy to get it. We definitely nudging the government to go further, closer to the federal targets, but we're really happy about that program and continue to follow it and support it. So yes, yeah. And I would just highlight the work of especially some of our larger conservation groups, like you heard from Nature NB, but CPAWS, NB, Nature Trust, Nature Conservancy of Canada, all those groups have done great work around that program as well.
Excellent. I'm glad to hear. And I guess to just follow up with, when this program is in fact complete and fully rolled out, what positives can you foresee with respect to climate change and mitigation plans?
Well, like you would have heard from Adam Cheeseman earlier, like yes, we can talk about nature-based solutions, but just natural solutions, like protecting those natural areas that we have will, forests, as we know, our carbon sinks. We need to keep that carbon in the ground, in the trees. So if we can protect these areas or restore areas that have been cut, that is going to help us towards our climate goals. As you know, the federal government has ambitious goals around tree planting, so that's going to be an approach they're going to take, a strategy they're going to take, and we need to be involved in that in New Brunswick. So I think protecting these areas, aside from all the co-benefits that we've mentioned as well, people like to enjoy them, the wildlife, protecting of species, but just flat out keeping those trees in the ground to make sure that carbon stays there.
Oh, that's great. And I think what I'm hearing is, there's good things happening, but clearly we need to do a better job of communicating this story. So I appreciate your answers to the questions. And like I say, I'll just defer to colleagues for any further questions. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Collins. Ms. Caucus.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and good afternoon, Mr. Murphy. It's been a long day. I don't know whether you've tuned in all day, but we're pleased to hear. I'm sorry, Mr. Chair, I'm getting an echo. Are you? No? Okay. I just wanted to clarify things. I don't know if you know any of my background, but I was a reporter for a great many years, decades, and communication is very important to me and raising awareness. So I don't understand what you meant when you said we have to be more, I'm assuming you meant government have to be more truthful in our communications. Could you clarify that for me?
Sure, I would have used the word honest, but basically what I mean is...
No, I heard truthful.
Oh, okay. Either way, what I mean by that is we need to not shy away from, and when we communicate, telling people what's coming. I mean, climate change is going to radically impact our lives. So we need to not shy away from telling people the truth when we communicate climate change, but at the same time, finding a way to remain for the message to remain hopeful and really, as Dr. Comeau stresses, to speak to what people love, to kind of pull up their heartstrings. So that's what I meant by that. We don't need to downplay what's coming. People can, as we saw with COVID, people can absorb that and kind of make the decisions that are right for them, but we need to give them the information.
Sure. We need to make them aware of the situation and the problems and the issues that we face. I agree. And I know coastal protection efforts have been successful, and I was so happy to hear about one of the groups that's part of your organization is doing so well with gardening and the students, the schools taking part. We have some of those down here in Charlotte County. So what I'm hearing you say is that good things are happening, but we just need to be better, all of us, including you, at telling the story. Is that your message to us?
On the point of communication, yes. Like we need to be like, it's someone brought up Greta Thunberg, but like as she says, like if the house is on fire, let's act like it. Like let's like we did with COVID, let's get out there every day or so and let people know where things are at. What we're asking from them, like this is what this is going to require, right? So I just have not seen that kind of forceful messaging coming from government as I saw it through the last 2 years through COVID. So all of us really, but coming from government is something I would particularly like to see. Yeah.
Is your group doing that type of messaging?
Yes, through our members. Like we have 100, like we're a network.
But to the public. But to the public.
Absolutely, yes. Yeah.
Where, on social media or?
On social media, through public engagement events, through any platform really we can find, organizing things like conferences, writing letters to the editor, writing op-eds, buying ads. Like, you know, I think each group probably has its own strategy. But I did really like the suggestion maybe as a network, one thing that we could caucus around is better climate messaging. And that has been a topic at many of our conferences, how to better communicate science, how to better communicate climate. But as an ongoing caucus, it's not one that we currently have in place, but I would definitely like look into that, how we can do it better. Right? Yeah.
That's something that you yourself are going to work on, your group.
Yeah, I mean,
okay.
I think we all need to figure out how to get the message out, right? Like how we can get the message out better and more effectively.
Yeah.
There's a lot of noise out there, as you would know. There's like people have so much stuff coming in and out of their ears that it's a struggle.
Yeah, we need to get the proper information out there. All right, thank you, Mr. Chair. Those are my questions.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Murphy, thank you for joining us this afternoon. I'll give you an opportunity for any closing comments that you may wish to make.
Yeah, I mean, the only thing I would say in closing is just like the NBN is, if not like the largest, it's one of the largest provincial environmental networks in the country. So we definitely punch above our weight when it comes to environmental protection here in New Brunswick. And I think we should see that as an asset. And maybe it's a very maritime trait, but it's definitely a strong asset and we should lean on that. So just consider, as you're updating the plan, the role that the local environmental groups play, and continue supporting them as best you can. And thank you. Merci and voilà.